Well, good morning, good afternoon. Today we are going to continue on in the series with Ecclesiastes. Today we're in chapter number 3, and I got Val with me here. She's taking a nap. Hopefully she'll do that the rest of the video here. But I'm not going to read through the chapter today, but we will look at a couple points in this chapter to see what we can take away. Starting in verses number 1 through 8, starting in verse number 1, he says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every activity under the sun." He's talking about seasons, cycles, changes. Verse 2, he says, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to harvest. And he goes on and on through all the way through the end of verse 8, where it says a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So he's focusing here on the rhythm of life and the cycle that it is. And sometimes, I'm sure we feel like this every day. It's work, sleep, eat, work, sleep, eat, and sometimes not even all three of those in the same 24-hour period. And then we go on to the next section in the chapter, which is verses 9 through 15. We see that the key theme in that section is God's sovereignty over time. So the first part there, where he's talking about the rhythm of life, the next several verses he gets into, even though these things seem to just cycle and cycle and cycle, God is still sovereign in these events. Listen to what he says here in verse number 10 and 11 of chapter 3. "I have seen the burden God has placed on us all. Yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart, but even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from the beginning to the end." He talks about the burden that God has placed on us. He's referring to the Genesis chapter 3, that work was actually had been cursed because of the fall. So that's the burden he's talking about there. But look at verse number 11. He says, yet God's made everything beautiful. And I guess Val's done. He said, God's made everything beautiful, and he's put in the human heart the ability to think or to dwell on eternity, yet we still can't see the whole picture. She's back now. She just wanted to get a ball. So moving on now, we see the next section in verse number 16. "I have also noticed under the sun there is evil in the courtroom. Yes, even in the courts of law are corrupt." So he gets into the next several verses about how judgment takes place on the earth. So in conclusion here, we see that he started the book off, or the chapter off, talking about the rhythm of life. He moved into then talking about, even though things have a rhythm and a cycle, God still is sovereign in all those events. Then we see in a couple verses there, 16 through 18, where he talks about the injustices that happen throughout life. But then we sort of see a conclusion in this chapter. In verse number 22, it says, "So I saw that there is nothing better for people than to be happy in their work." You know, there's a big difference between being happy in your work and being happy at work. Big difference just between in and at. Being happy in your work simply is the ability for us to be fulfilled within the situation God's put us in. Being happy at work is dependent on your environment. And we can all agree that sometimes our environments aren't always the greatest sometimes. So what are some ways that we can truly be happy in our work? A couple verses I want to just quickly look at before we close here. How can we be happy in our work? Philippians 4:8 says, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about these things that are excellent and worthy of praise." If you dwell on those items listed there in Philippians 4:8, it will give you a greater ability to be happy in your work. If you don't dwell on those things, then you're forced to only be happy at your work, and that is dependent on a good environment. A couple other verses, Colossians 3:23, "Whatsoever you do, work heartily as unto the Lord and not unto man." If you keep your focus on your daily tasks, that you're doing them for God and not for man, it will sure help the attitude be happy in your work. Proverbs 16, verse number 3, "Commit to the Lord whatever you do, and he will establish your plans." So understanding that God is sovereign, God can work in the most messed up situations. Think about the trials that Job went through, all for God's master plan. Joseph could be happy in his work because God was working a much bigger plan. So in closing, we want to keep the final master thought for the whole book of Ecclesiastes in view. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse number 13 says, "That's the whole story. Here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and obey his commandments." That is the ultimate goal that we should be reaching in our everyday Christian life. Love y'all. Make it a great day.